Okay, just let me know.
Y-
Cool. So I'll just kick off straight away, shall I?
Yeah. Well, first
Yeah.
of all, thank you for
Okay.
doing us this webinar and for the topic. I guess that is very timely topic. Not many people have been talking about Ashby, and of course, it's like the fundament of all the things that we do. So very timely, very exciting to have you talking about Ashby and you. So, welcome. Would you like to do the webinar just first, or would you rather have interruptions and questions?
If there is something that people don't get or don't understand as we go through it, it's probably best to jump in there and then,
Okay.
but leave any broader discussions, if there are broader discussions, to the end, probably.
Okay. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So I shall start. First of all, an apology in advance that well, there's several apologies required. Um, but the first is that this is kind of quite going to be quite a technical and involved presentation, and to make sure that I got all my thoughts in order, I produced slide notes, but unfortunately, I haven't managed to work out how to present this in such a way that I can see my slide notes and you can't. So I'm going to be doing it without slide notes. So I'm going to be even more incoherent than normal. So as I said, just if there's something that I've missed or haven't explained properly, shout there and then, and I'll try to remedy that. Right, a bit of background. Like all of you, I guess, I didn't know anything about Ashby and Ashby's law until I first started getting into the viable systems model. And um, it kind of grabbed me straight away because it explained a lot of stuff that I'd seen that felt like it was law-like. Um, but for which nobody else had an explanation. So things like, stupid things like the more volatile an environment is, the more flexibility you need in order to be able to respond to it, which at one level is common sense, but I was always wanted something a little bit more than common sense to fall back on. So first sort of introduced to Ashby over 20 years ago, and spent a lot of time going back into the original his original um, books and articles to make sure that I understood it well. But I've always kind of had a feeling that there was something a little bit, not flaky, but something that I couldn't quite grasp that didn't feel quite right. And that always concerned me because it was really important to me to have sort of firm intellectual foundations for the stuff I was doing. I also felt that uh, other people I knew in the cybernetics community kind of, I didn't know whether they really understood it better than me and I was just a bit stupid, or whether other people didn't worry about this as much as I did. And it always kind of concerned me that people would glibly say things like variety absorb variety, which is kind of true at one level, but is also a significant oversimplification. So this has been hanging around. This has been something gnawing at me for decades. And I've kept on going back to it and thinking like I kind of chipped away at this a little bit more and understood it a little bit more. Um, but I never found this is not the kind of thing you can share with your spouse. And so when Angela said, "Would you talk?" I thought, at last, a group of fellow nerds I can talk to about this. who might understand me and might appreciate what I've been trying to do. Um, so uh, that's your unfortunate role in this. You're going to be treated to my nerdiest thoughts. So I think I can see how all of this kind of stuff I'm going to talk about has practical applications, but it is very abstract. Um, and so I apologize for that in advance. And I hope that at least some of you are interested in that kind of abstract stuff as well. At the end of the day, even if you don't find a practical use for this, hopefully you'll get some kind of reassurance that the foundations of what we do are secure, even if it's a little bit more complex than we might have appreciated up until now. So that's a very lengthy introduction and apology in advance, and I'll now jump into the content. A little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me. My background is I'm a finance person. I used to have a proper job in Unilever, but I got interested in this by first of all getting dragged into a group who wanted to replace traditional budgeting in organizations. For those of you who don't know, traditional budgeting is tremendously important, still is. It's the process whereby once a year, people set targets, lock down budgets, and then somehow lock down budgets. But as you know, organizations are working in a very dynamic environment, and Ashby's law says it won't work. Yeah. Yeah. The system does not have requisite variety. And that was the kind of light bulb moment for me. That's what made Ashby's law so important because it explained for me, explained why what we did, what I did as a professional finance person just would not work and why people's experience of this is so miserable and unfulfilling. That led me on to reading beer stuff, and I started a PhD in 2003. Angela was my supervisor, finished it in 2010. And around about that time, I retired from Unilever very early. So I spent the first half, the way I explain it, I spent the first half of my career doing things wrong, badly, because they were cybernetically unsound. And the second half of my career trying to solve that and coming up with practical solutions, which are all based on cybernetic theory, but hidden so deeply that ordinary people can understand it. At least that's their theory. So that's a little bit about me. Now, an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, the bad news. Variety doesn't absorb variety, at least not all of it. So that aphorism is a little bit misleading. Ashby's law isn't a law, it's a theorem. And it isn't inviolable. So there will be situations where you can regulate a system without having more variety than the environment has. Yeah. So that's the bad news. The good news is, as some people like Dave Snowden say, complexity doesn't change the rules of the game. Yeah. Ashby's law still works in a complex environment. It's only but in a subtle way. And I think I can show how evolution, which might be biological evolution, but it could be social evolution in terms of organizations surviving and thriving, selects for regulatory systems that do comply with Ashby's law. And so I think this is still, although it's not quite as simple as it first appeared when I started working on this all those years ago, it's still a firm foundation for cybernetics. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, so you know what's coming. So there are two main sections. First of all, I'm going to be talking about regulatory capacity, because Ashby's law is about the capacity to regulate. Do you have enough variety? There is a second issue, which I'm going to tackle in the second half, which is to do with the effectiveness of regulation, particularly in complex environments. So I'm going to start off with capacity. Right, we all know this, don't we? Ashby's law, as stated in the Introduction to Cybernetics from 1956, in which Stafford Beer asserted that it was a cosmic joke that everybody ignores this all the time. And certainly that was the case in business. So really the law is this one here. Regulatory variety has to be greater to or equal than environmental variety divided by goal variety, but it's normally stated like this as a log. So regulatory variety has to be greater or equal than environmental variety less than goal variety. And I'll persevere with that because adding up and taking away is easier than dividing and multiplying. And as I say, people glibly say only variety absorbs variety, but that's not true. And the reason it's not true is because there is another term on the right-hand side called goal variety. And to put it crudely, if you don't care what the output is, if you got your goal variety is infinite, then it doesn't matter. Your regulatory variety could be zero. Yeah. And this is really important in kind of my line of work because how precisely that you set targets is an important factor in determining the regulatory variety you need for a system to succeed. And the problem we have in finance is not only do we have very little flexibility because we fix everything once a year, so low regulatory variety, but we also have very low goal variety, and that's a common thing societally generally. People come up with lots and lots of targets, which are all specified in great detail, which means that they have low goal variety, which means that you are guaranteed to fail to regulate effectively. Yeah, so and people don't understand, and I don't think the cybernetic community understands this issue about goal variety. I don't think I've come across a paper or reference anywhere which makes this point. So really, the aphorism should be only regulatory variety and tolerance absorb variety. Yeah. So how you specify what you're trying to achieve is an important part of designing a regulatory system that has the capacity to succeed. Okay, so that's the first thing. So whilst the only variety absorbs variety is a kind of good global statement, it's if you're getting into the nitty-gritty of trying to design regulatory systems that will work or stand a chance of working, you have to take account of the goal state. So that's the first thing. The second thing, is Ashby's law a law? And the answer is no. And I think the word law overclaims because a law is usually used in reference to something which is empirical, which is being proven to be empirically true. And that's not what it is. It's a statement which is based on axioms. And a number of people, and this guy is one of them, have claimed as a result, it's a deductive system rather than empirical law, and it is a tautology like mathematics or geometry. It's tautological. And therefore, they claim it's trivial and of no interest. And this guy, Winter, was Russell Acouph's, one of Russell Acouph's students. And consequently, his view informed Acouph's view that cybernetics of the sort that we are used to is founded on something which is tautological and trivial. But I think I'm not too worried about that because Ashby knew that. um, in some places, he used the term, this theorem is primarily a statement about possible arrangements in a rectangular table. So he knew it was a theorem. Why he called it a law, I don't know. And as a result, it owes nothing to experiment. So if you accept it's an axiomatic statement based on assumptions, which is logically robust, if you accept that, it owes nothing to experiment. But that's not a problem because there are many other things which are axiomatic systems. So, for instance, Euclidean geometry is an axiomatic system, and nobody says it's trivial. And I think well, the reason why he used law and theory was his Ashby stuff came out around about the time that Shannon's information theory was developed. And so the idea of having a theorem which is purely based on an axiomatic, a sort of rigorously logical axiomatic system wasn't problematic, and it didn't make it irrelevant to the real world because in modern IT is based on Shannon's information theory. So it's possible for it to be a axiomatic theorem and extremely valuable in the real world. So I think the description of Ashby's law as a law has created a lot of unnecessary noise. So the so-called law of requisite variety, is a theorem based on axioms. And if the axioms, the assumptions are valid and predictions which you make based on those accord with what you observe in the real world, that's absolutely fine. And the key axioms is the variety of the environment, the goal, and the regulator are discrete binary distinctions made by the sensory apparatus of the regulator. So as you know, variety isn't something which exists out there. Variety is something that our sensory equipment can detect. Yeah. So the capacity of the regulator to make distinctions is important. So I won't go into that in too. You might be wondering why I'm blathering on about that. It's quite significant when a bit later on when we're trying to understand the robustness of Ashby's law in practical applications. Before I get on to the next thing, is everybody comfortable with this? Am I going too slowly? Going too quickly? Is it all okay? Okay, I'm assuming if nobody shouts at me, I'm assuming it's okay. Right. Is Ashby's law, can we prove Ashby's law? This is one of the things I started to work on in the very early days, sort of while I was still in Unilever and I'd got a proper job sort of. And what I did to prove this, at least to myself, was I built this causal matrix, which is a bit like the things that Ashby uses in his books. And why is it a causal matrix? Right. So down the left-hand side, you can see regulatory states going from R1 to R2, R3, so on and so forth. Across the top, you can see environmental states. So you've got a regulatory variety of 6, an environmental variety of 6 across the top. And in the middle, you've got output states of the system, which go from 1 to 6. So why is this called a causal matrix? Because it shows how the regulator and the environment together create or cause the output states. So if you've only got one regulatory state, R1, the output is caused by the environment. Yeah. So it's if the environment's at state 2, then the output will be at state 2, and so on and so forth. If, on the other hand, the environment is held constant, it's your regulatory actions that cause the output. And when you, for instance, you're doing a scientific experiment, what you're very often trying to do is to constrain the environment so you can see the impact of the actions which you're taking. But in real life, we've got both these things. We've got both the things happening in the environment, and we've got regulatory actions that we're taking, and they collectively cause the system output. And here I'm treating this as a black box. This is sort of standard black box thinking. Right, and I used this to explore Ashby's law visually as opposed to algebraically. And you'll see the way I've arranged this, I've arranged it very simply in terms of R1 to R6 in natural order, E1 to E6 in natural order, and all of the output states in natural order, but with no repetition on rows or columns. And I didn't know this at the time I started using this, but this is something which is called a Latin square, which Euler, the famous German mathematician, did a lot of work on in the 18th century. And it's for those of you who like puzzles, it's what lies underneath Sudoku puzzles. Yeah, the Sudoku puzzle just blanks out a whole load of these and asks you to work out what the content of the cell should be. And when I used this, I didn't realize it, but it's actually really important when we are thinking about the practical challenges. So this mapping, of this mapping of output states to input states and to environmental states and regulatory action states is basically a model of the system. Yeah. So if you like, that's an instantiation of the Cohen-Ashby theorem. Yeah. So to be an effective regulator, you've got to be able to know for any given environmental state and any given regulatory action what the output would be. Yeah. So that kind of is a demonstration of the Cohen-Ashby theorem. But what I didn't appreciate, and which is really important for practically thinking about how regulation works, is that particular arrangement, very simple arrangement, which is very ordered, low entropy arrangement, is only one of 812 million possible permutations. So there are over 800 ways that those outputs could be arranged. So what that says is, whilst Ashby-Conant theorems make sense in practice, nobody is ever going to have a full understanding of the system in the real world. It's just going to be impossibly too complicated. So before I dive into that a little bit more, I'll share with you what I did to prove Ashby's law when I presented this when I was still in Unilever, and I presented it. I had a similar problem in Unilever. I was looking around for nerdy people to present this stuff to, and I had an opportunity to present at our research labs, Unilever research labs, which in Colworth. And there, you you can't shake a stick without hitting somebody with two PhDs there, and a lot of them are mathematicians. So I thought, oh, I'll present it to them, and they're going to be tremendously impressed. Um, as if. So basically, what I did was I showed them this. This is the causal matrix from the last slide, and I said, look, if you've got a goal state of 1, and let's say the goal state is 06, and I've painted those in green. You've got a goal state of 1, and we've got if in order to regulate this system, I'm trying to think of what I did here with the maths. In order to do that, it demonstrates that you need, for every environmental state, you need a corresponding regulatory state. Yeah, so this proves Ashby's law. And if you changed it so that you've got two goal states, so instead of just 06, you've got 06 and 05, you can regulate this system perfectly with only three regulatory states, the ones in the boxes here, R1, R3, and R5. So if your goal variety is 2, requisite variety is 6, which is the environmental variety, divided by 2, which is the environmental variety, and therefore regulatory variety was 3, and hey presto, you've got R1, R2, and R1, R3, and R5 give you perfect regulation. So hey presto, that proves Ashby's law. Let me just, oh right, okay. And then you can show if you have a repetition on the rows, so in this case, you've got on this row, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you've got 01 repeated twice. So it's 01, 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. You don't have 06. In those circumstances, you don't you need more than 6 regulatory responses in order to regulate this system perfectly. So that, if you like, justifies the regulatory variety has to be greater than or equal to environmental variety divided by goal states. So I presented this, and I expected my audience to be amazed and astonished and incredibly impressed by this. Instead, I got sort of yawns and speaking to one of the mathematicians I was on friendly terms with there, he said, "Well, the problem with this, Steve, is what you've just shown is just a product of the matrix that you've constructed." Yeah. So what you haven't demonstrated is that this theorem works irrespective of how you order these output cells. Yeah. So that's why, and I left with the feeling it was their perception of this was a bit like Acuff students. This is kind of trivial. So I'm thinking this is really, really important. And their response this was a kind of trivial output of an arrangement that I had selectively presented. And so what I've been trying to do is to explore whether that is in fact the case, whether Ashby's law only works if you've got a very orderly arrangement with low entropy, or whether it's something that holds irrespective of the degree of order. So, and this is important for, so that is really saying it's moving the discussion from thinking about the capacity of the system of a regulator to regulate a system through to the content of regulation. And I'll come back to that later, but the other thing that it got me thinking about was about this issue of how the scaling issues. Yeah, it's, as I said in the last slide, to have full knowledge of the system, a complete model of the system, requires that you understand all, whatever it was, 80 million permutations. But if you're only interested in regulating, in this case, a 06, you don't need a full model of the system. And in fact, if you've got a 6x6 matrix and a goal variety of 1, you don't need to worry about the permutations of the total matrix. You only need to worry about the permutations that affect your particular goal state. So, and that turns out that that's 720. And that's effectively the same problem you have with a combination lock, a combination lock. How many permutations are there of how many different ways can things be arranged such that you will always be able to achieve the goal state you want? So I'm beginning to, this is where I need my notes and I haven't got them. So bear with me if I get a little bit, if this isn't
Steve,
quite.
sorry to interrupt, but Ben has a question.
Okay. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Steve, thank you. Two quick clarifying questions, and it might even help. But one, if you could go back to that screen and just make
Yeah.
one more pass at explaining the goal variety and how that fits in to what we're seeing here. And then also, if a company understood this and then they were to attempt to operationalize it, would that then, are the actions embedded in here, like in the rows? I understand there's states on the row and the column of the borders. Is it like a if this state, then you take this action, or I could be off the mark there.
Okay. So to answer your first question is what the goal states are. I mean, if you put it in an organizational context, let's say your goal state is a certain profit number. Yeah. What this says is if you've got if you've defined your goal state extremely precisely, like the profit has to be 100.2 million in a year, then you need more regulatory variety to achieve that than if you've got a more broadly stated goal variety. So if your goal variety is instead stated as, instead of 100.2 million, if it's stated as a range, 95 to 105, anywhere within that range is satisfactory. You need less regulatory variety. And how much regulatory variety you need, in theory, you could calculate using Ashby's law. In practice, you can't because it's impossibly complicated. But knowing that guides your actions. So as a practical finance person, I can say, I know for sure that the more broadly you express your targets and the fewer of them there are, the greater your chance of achieving those.
That
Because
makes sense. That clarifies it.
yeah,
Perhaps like Mao Zedong's wheat quotas, or like a Soviet
yeah,
target
yeah,
that
yeah,
it's impossible. Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
gotcha.
I mean, this is, I mean, uh, companies in the capitalistic West use a process for trying to regulate their performance, which is directly analogous to Soviet style central planning. Yeah.
I know it well. Yeah.
And we know it didn't work. And in fact, one of the presentations I give sometimes, I'm conscious of time's moving on, but this is a great story. I took an extract describing Gosplan, which was the Soviet central economic planning process. And wherever the word Stalin was used, I substituted CEO. And whenever the Supreme Soviet was mentioned, I put company board and so on and so forth, and asked people to guess which company it was. Yeah, and people said, "Oh, it looks like Ford," or maybe it's Google. Um, it was only the only people who have ever guessed it were people who worked in Unilever's businesses in Eastern Europe. So they were brought up under Soviet central planning, and for them, they saw the resonance. Yeah,
I'm good. Thank you. That answered both questions.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Um, so, right. See if I can get my train of thought. So here, what I'm trying to do is to operationalize Ashby's law. And what I'm saying here is if you, and one of the problems you've got is complexity and scale. So if you're looking at all potential combinations of in a matrix, a one, right, by a 6 by 6 matrix, you get up to 812 million combinations, which makes the practical task of regulation impossible. So, in other words, basically, what I'm saying is the having a perfect model of the system a la Conan Ashby isn't possible. But if what you're interested in is just those aspects of the system that are relevant to your particular goal states, the regulatory burden collapses. So instead of 812 million permutations, you've got 720. And the reason for this is this causal matrix scales factorially, which is faster than exponential. So it's not possible to build a full model of the system. And there will be a strong selection pressure against size. I hope you begin to see where I'm going with this. It's the reason why it makes sense to break a system down into small components and regulate those individually, because it's not possible, practically possible, to regulate an entire system. It's simply too complex. So this explains modularity. It also explains hierarchies, which is interesting from a conceptual and theoretical point of view, but it's also practically very useful. And it explains why a lot of the features of the viable systems model. So let me I'll just explain this with a simple approach. This little matrix here says this number, if we have at the bottom environmental variety and on the left regulatory variety, if we wanted that implies a certain regulatory load in order to make sure the surplus unabsorbed variety is zero. And that's something you can work out as a permutation. So if you've got a big system like this with environmental variety of 12, regulatory value of 12, to absorb the variety completely, you need to take account of 479 million permutations. Yeah, that is intractable. So how practically do you deal with that? One way is to chunk it up into smaller chunks. Yeah. So if you like, more system ones, more operational units. Yeah. So if you break up that 12 by 12 matrix into two 6 by 6 matrices, the combined regulatory burden drops from 479 million to 1,400. So modularization is a tremendously effective way of making big systems capable of being regulated effectively. But there's another trick, which collapses the regulatory burden down further from 1,400 to 700. And that's if you've got two smaller systems that you regulate imperfectly, so that you've got some unabsorbed variety, and that unabsorbed variety is regulated by a system at another level of recursion. Yeah. So that demonstrates how, and I don't know whether you've ever come across Arvid Orlin, who came up with the what he called the law of requisite hierarchy. So that little toy demonstration there shows how modularization and bringing in hierarchies makes what would otherwise be an impossibly difficult regulatory burden more manageable. So it's the reason why we organize. It makes sense to organize organizations in as modular hierarchies. Yeah. And actually the more not the more imperfect they are, if they're imperfect, it actually doesn't matter. It actually it actually helps to compress the regulatory burden. Okay, so that's me thinking about capacity, what that means in relation to Ashby's law, and working through some practical strategies that help you to make systems which would otherwise be too difficult to regulate tractable from a regulatory point of view. Now I want to move on to the content. So that's about capacity. This is now about content. So this is now going to address the issue about the patterns that the guys in Colworth challenged me on. Before I go on, how am I doing? And have you got any questions? Okay. So what I'm trying to do here is to effectively tackle the issue of complexity. Right. Do any of you know who this guy is? Dave Snowden. He is he likes to present himself as a complexity scientist, and he's very dogmatic and rather combative in his style. But interestingly, he's really not ever published anything. He's very famous for this, which is the Cynefin framework. Have you come across this? But we really never published anything on it, and I think the reason is that there's an awful lot of bullshit. And if he published it, he would get called out for his bullshit. And I kind of only realized this when I started corresponding with him. And I mentioned to him that I was interested in the links between cybernetics and complexity science and all that kind of stuff. And I mentioned that I was as a follower of Stafford Beer, and he said, "Oh, if Stafford Beer had been alive at the time of a complexity scientist, he'd be at the time of complexity science, he'd be doing what I'm doing. He wouldn't have created the viable systems model because it's all wrong, and it's which is bollocks. Not least because he was alive at the time that complexity science was invented in the early 90s. And his view was, having spoken to Elena, I know his view was, it's interesting what they're doing, but they still don't really understand it. The other thing he said is, of course, when I developed the Cynefin approach, I could demonstrate that Ashby's law doesn't apply. Yeah, so basically what he was saying is if a system is complex, Ashby's law doesn't apply. And I thought, that feels like bollocks, but I can't prove it's bollocks. And if I dig down, maybe I can kind of understand where my intuition comes from. And if I'm right, it'd actually be really good because it would help integrate cybernetics with complexity science. And instead of these being two kind of competing worldviews who either pretend that the other group doesn't exist or says they're all talking shit, it'd be great to be able to say, actually, this perspective shows that there's more commonality than people appreciate. So that's really what I set out to do. So first of all, you have to ask the question, what is complexity? And the classic definition is there is no obvious pattern to cause and effect. Yeah, and that makes sense at one level, but at another level it doesn't, because that seems to imply that complexity is something I don't understand. And if Ian, you understood it, you would say that's not complex. And that doesn't feel right. Yeah. If you're going to say complexity science is it has to be, there has to be some ontological reality to it rather than just the state of knowledge of the observer. So the question is complexity a real thing, or is it just in people's heads? And I think it is. I think it is a real thing. And going back to my matrix here, all of these, of the 812 million possible permutations of this matrix, here are three of them. And this one, there is simple, and there's a very obvious relationship between cause and effect. If as the environmental states go from left to right, then the regulatory actions I need to be able to achieve my goal, or the regulatory actions to achieve any defined state, and I've just happened to pick out the goal state, will also will change in an ordered fashion. So that's obviously simple. If I generate this matrix, this pattern of O1s to O6 using I used a very simple algorithm to generate that pattern. If I make it slightly more complicated, I get a more complicated pattern. And you can say, you can see how somebody who understood this system could say, oh, I know what you have to do if it's E2 or E3, but it's more complicated. If, however, I use a slightly more complicated algorithm, and what I did here was simply reversed the orders of these O1 to O6, as well as shifting them one position to the moving up a bit. So this isn't random. This is generated by a very simple algorithm, but it's much more complex. So based on this kind of insight, my theory is that what we call complexity is to do with what mathematicians call symmetry. Yeah. And particularly transitional symmetry. So complexity is the loss, my hypothesis is a loss of transitional symmetry. So transitional symmetry is a property where an object or pattern remains unchanged after being moved or translated in a specific direction by a certain distance. Yeah. So that has high transitional symmetry, that has low transitional symmetry. So I think that's what complexity means in practice. It's a system where the relationship between cause and effect isn't clear because there's low transitional symmetry. And it's obviously more difficult to regulate. It's easy to build the knowledge to regulate that system. It's much more difficult to build the knowledge to regulate that system. So at that level, complexity doesn't inherently invalidate Ashby's law, despite what Snowden asserted, but it does make regulation more difficult. And so my conjecture based on that is because complex systems are difficult to regulate, biological systems will evolve to favor more simple ordered systems, i.e. with high transitional symmetry. And also, therefore, it makes sense to organize social organizations according to that principle as well. So let me take to the next level. But is it possible for there to be circumstances where regulatory variety is less than environmental variety? So does he have something? Is he right in some way? And it's easy to come up with a situation where that is the case. So for example, if in row R1, our goal state, 06, was repeated twice, we don't need R2. And therefore, in order to regulate this system, we don't need regulatory variety of 6 or more. We need 5. So, that's worrying. At this point, I feel the ground beginning to collapse under my feet. However, that only works when you're repeating a value which relates to your goal state. As we saw already, if in this case 01 is repeated twice rather than 06 being repeated twice, R6 doesn't have the capacity to regulate this system. So in other words, if we've just got minor duplications, there's a potential for what I call local efficiency, i.e. with having a regulatory variety less than the environmental variety, but you don't get universal efficiency. Oh, and by the way, in this particular case, in nature, it's unlikely that an organism would lose the capacity to use R2, because in nature you see redundancy built in all over the place. It's the reason why we've got 2 kidneys rather than 1. So for evolutionary reasons, we have redundancy built in. So that's another reason why in practice, Ashby's law tends to still hold. So minor duplications allow local but not universal efficiency. But then I thought, what happens if you have major duplications? And this really spooked me. So in this particular case, O1, every one of these output values is repeated twice. So O1 is repeated here and here, O2 there and there. So in this case, and as you can see, what basically we've got, I've taken the pattern of the smaller 6x6 matrix and just duplicated it. And so I was thinking, does this invalidate Ashby's law? Because in this case, there's a very seemingly obvious example of where regulatory variety is much lower than environmental variety. But then I went back to Ashby, and Ashby recognized that. And again, this is something I've never seen referred to. He said, if you've got duplicates, so duplicates in rows, then you can restate Ashby's law as regulated variety, or the log of regulated variety must be greater than equal to the log of environmental variety less the log of goal variety less the log of the duplicates. And Ashley calls it an interesting extension. But that seems to kind of cut the ground from under the feet of of this simple, apparently universal law that everything that I value intellectually is being built on. But the more I thought about it, the more it actually is not quite that straightforward. And the reason for this is, on the face of it, we can have low regulatory variety and a very simple process to regulate it, because this has got a high transitional symmetry and that's got high transitional symmetry. But actually, from the perspective of the regulator, that doesn't work, because if E1 to E6, the pattern in E1 to E6 is exactly the same as the pattern from E1 to E12, the regulator wouldn't recognize E7 to E12 as separate distinctions. So from the position of the regulator, it's not variety. You can only get this situation happening if E7 to E12 doesn't repeat the patterns of E1 to E6. So in other words, if it's something like that. So if patterns are non-recurring, and when patterns are non-recurring, you lose transitional symmetry. So that led me to something which I've just christened Morlidge's principle of regulatory complexity, which is it's not possible to have regulatory systems that are efficient and simple. So you can have ones that are efficient, i.e. where RV is less than EV, but they will be complex. You can have systems that are simple with high transitional symmetry, but they won't be efficient. So in that way, for my own benefit, I think I've demonstrated a link between Ashby's law, the regulatory science of cybernetics, and the problems of complexity dealt with by complexity theorists. So the aphorism should be only regulatory variety, tolerance, and versatility absorb variety. But with versatility comes complexity. So, okay, we're okay. I think I'm getting there, and I haven't confused myself too much. Hopefully, I haven't confused you. So, what implications does that have practically when we build in the thing we talked about earlier, which is about modularity and hierarchy? And I think what this demonstrates is where emergent properties come from. Because that's one thing that's always bugged me, that we talk about emergent. I mean, a feature of complex systems is they're emergent. Yeah. The large system displays qualities which are not evident in the subsystems. Yeah. So I think I can now show why that is and demonstrate what emergence is. But you might disagree. Let's see. So we've got this 6x6 matrix, which is complex. Yeah, it's the same one that you saw a few slides ago. It's got a complex pattern, and it's got a regulatory load of 720. In an ideal world, what would we want to do? We want to reduce the, if you were an organism and wanted to survive, you want to reduce the regulatory load. Yeah. So there's less stuff for you to have to worry about, less permutations. And you want to make it simple to regulate by creating transitional symmetry. Yeah. And a few slides ago, we showed how if we modularize it and introduce hierarchies, we can reduce the regulatory load. But in so doing, I think we also can reduce complexity at the local level. Let me show you what I mean. Hopefully this is going to make sense. So we've reduced the regulatory load by chopping that matrix up into two and two here, which are imperfectly regulated. So I'm not seeking to be able to achieve O6 in all cases of E1 to E3. I'm just going to try and absorb the variety from E1 to E2, and I'll leave the variety in E3 to be absorbed by a regulator at a level up. Similarly here. And you can see by doing this, I've not only collapsed the regulatory variety, but in terms of this regulator, the task of regulation is now much simpler, because it says if R6, sorry, if E1, choose R6, if E2, which is different by 1, choose R5, which is different by 1. Similarly here. So this has by chopping it up into chunks, you've got more transitional symmetry. And you see for the regulator at the higher level, again, it's super simple. Yeah. You've only got 4 options, and it's the regulatory strategy required are very simple. So I'm hoping that what this shows is this kind of arrangement, which my contention is this is what nature will selectively evolve towards, not only reduces regulatory load, but each of these, because they've got higher transitional symmetry, is easier to regulate. The system as a whole, if you've got these 3 together, is as complex as that. But if you look at each individual component, they're simple. So from the perspective of the whole, you would say, taken together, this system will display complex emergent behavior, which doesn't exist in the subsystems. Yeah, I think.
Can I just ask you to clarify more precisely what you mean by transitional symmetry?
Right,
Because
transitional
in
symmetry.
biology, it's slightly different.
Okay. I'm not a mathematician. Yeah, but I'm using the word transitional symmetry as a mathematician would use it, as somebody who was interested in tiling theory, that kind of thing. It's where
Yeah, it's
when
repeating identical shapes or
yeah,
patterns,
when you move,
but it's not tessellation.
it's a simple tessellation. There are different types of symmetries. You can get mirror symmetries,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
where that pattern is the mirror of that pattern. That's one kind of symmetry. Another kind of symmetry is rotational symmetry,
yeah.
where that pattern is the same as that pattern rotated. Transitional symmetry is where you move, where when you move to in a direction, the patterns will change in a predictable way. And the reason why I'm focusing on transitional symmetry is
Right.
because that's the way biological systems regulate. If you've got more sugar, produce more insulin. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that biological systems tend to have simple regulatory systems whereby more of X is regulated by more of Y or less of Y. Yeah. And that kind of arrangement is basically transitional symmetry. If X increases, increase Y by a certain amount. Mathematically, that's transitional symmetry. Now, as I say, I'm not a mathematician. I might be doing horrible violence to to some scientific principles of which I'm aware, but it kind of makes sense to me. And as I say, that kind of explains why we see those kind of patterns in nature and why the viable system is organized like it is, i.e. highly modular and hierarchical. Yeah, it makes sense from the point of view of managing load, but also it makes sense from managing regulatory strategies, because the regulatory strategies at a modular level can be simpler than those that you see at a higher level. And this all might seem a bit familiar to you because, so anyway, so conjecture 3 is modular systems can generate complex emergent behavior from simple components. So, yeah, so that's conjecture 3. This argument might seem familiar to you. Are any of you familiar with Herbert Simon's work on complexity? There was a famous paper in 1962 called The Architecture of Complexity. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And he makes a similar point, is the reason why you get complexity in nature is because you have hierarchical systems. And he says nature will select for those because stable small systems which aggregate are more likely to exist than that. Stable small systems are more likely to exist than stable complex big systems. And therefore, complexity will emerge from the combination of small, simple systems into larger, complex organizations. So we've got a confluence here of Ashby's law and Herbert Simon's work on the architecture of complexity, which modern complexity scientists don't seem to know about. Yeah. Because modern complexity science, I think that the way I rationalize it to myself is modern complexity science says this is very complex, and the only way we can understand it is by simulating. So it's very computational, whereas people like Herbert Simon and Ashby didn't have that ability, and so they had to rationally make sense of complexity. And I don't think the complexity scientists have really recognized that there is a logical foundation to their stuff. It isn't just some magical something which magically emerges from a simulation, where you put in simple rules and you get complex outcomes. It's not magic. There's a logical reason for that. So you'll be pleased to know I'm coming to the end. So the conclusion of this ramble is Ashby's law isn't a law, it's a theorem, and since it's based on axiomatic assumptions which might not be true, like the repetition of values in rows, it's not inviolable. It's only as sound as its assumptions. But since engineered regulatory systems are designed to be simple, and basic biological regulatory systems are more likely to be simple and have functional redundancy, there is a tendency for regulatory systems to conform to Ashby's law. If you've got natural systems like economies or ecologies, that they might not be conform quite so strictly to Ashby's law. And they are by definition very complex and much more difficult, and it's much more difficult to identify efficient regulatory strategies. So in social and biological systems, regulatory variety is likely to be greater than environmental variety. So therefore, Ashby's law is still a solid foundation for cybernetic inquiry. And all of this explains why social systems and biological systems have a modular hierarchical nature, and it also explains complexity as an emergent phenomenon. And I think that's the end. It is. So.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Very interesting and deep presentation. We only have 10 minutes, or 14 minutes to do questions. So who would like to start?
And first of all, before we do that, can I say thank you as well? Because I've been working on this stuff on my own for years and years, and thank you for turning up, hearing me out, and listening generously.
No, I think that it is really interesting and very unique, Steve. I haven't heard anyone trying to demonstrate with so much rigor the way that you understand Ashby, the limitations of Ashby's law, and compare with all the arguments of complexity scientists that I think that have been very detrimental because create a kind of dispute between cybernetics and complexity sciences that is not useful, hasn't contributed to improve things, and as you say, there may be gaps in the way that they present things that you have uncovered very, very, very nicely, very interesting. So well done. Really, really interesting work.
So questions, I saw a couple of hands go up.
Yes, please. So I cannot see them. Can you stop sharing your screen and then?
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah.
So Ian.
Yeah. Made me jump. First of all, thank you, Steve. Really, really great. After 30-odd years of using BSM and Ashby's law as a fundamental principle, what you've explained has really helped to underpin what I've observed in the world of actually trying to work with this stuff. One question for you is that what I always observe is that often a low variety regulator has an ability to massively amplify its variety over a much higher variety environment, which does not have much ability to actually amplify its variety. And so it gets squashed that way.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, once I go outside the confines of what I've just shared with you, my brain starts hurting a lot. So, so I can't really comment constructively on that.
Okay.
And I noticed Marcus is here. I don't know whether you remember, Marcus. There was a meeting sponsored by Fredman Malik in San Galan about 15 years ago,
That's right.
where I first raised this issue of the importance of goal variety.
Yes.
And you came up to me afterwards and said, you need to work on that. You need to work on that because nobody else is working on it. And that's one of the reasons why, I'm here now, is the encouragement you gave me back then.
Great to see you again and see the evolution of your work. It's impressive, and I hope you will publish it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is publishable. I don't know where.
No, we will invite you, Steve, in the centenary. We are organizing some special issues, and your work will be really, really interesting. I mean, it's a really interesting question and it's very thorough. So absolutely publishable. You should go ahead.
Okay. Well, maybe you and I can talk about that
Yes, we can talk
afterwards.
about that later.
Yeah. The
Okay,
challenge
great.
for me is how can I distill that into a elegantly argued paper of 12 pages or less of the kind that Herbert Simon managed to produce and Ashby himself. They're very, very good at taking a complex idea and expressing it succinctly, but in a way that's accessible to people who are non-experts. So that's my challenge.
Great. Ben, you have a question?
Yes. So just a couple more points to clarify or at least for me to translate it, the transitional symmetry, it sounds similar to stability or even ultra stability, or even after perturbations, the system can reorganize. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one, but is it close to what you're getting at, where even after a transformation, even though the micro components may be rearranged, the macro structure is still stable or has identity?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I'm going to plead. I'm going to wave the white flag of my brain hurting.
All right.
But
How about this? So
but
go ahead.
but however, what the point you raise is, I mean, I'll answer it I'll respond simply, which doesn't really answer your question, but my contention is a regulatory system that is organized such that there is high transitional symmetry is much more likely to be an effective regulator and therefore capable of delivering ultra stability. And the other thing, since I'm on my hobby horse now, ultra stability is what Nassim Taleb has made a fortune as describing as anti-fragile. And he's another person that's up there with Dave Snowden in my gallery of bullshitters. With the difference being he's not being quite as shy at publishing his work as Dave Snowden has been.
Forgive me for interrupting, Steve and Ben, but what you've just said, Steve, I met Dave Snowden once, and all I will say is, you may very well say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
How about this, Steve? So I can't help the fact that I'm an American and a pragmatic DNA, so I have to always tie everything to a real world scenario. So I'm from construction, and I'm essentially trying to do the same thing you've done for finance, but with construction, not with the companies, but with the projects. So one of the big challenges that I encountered always as a project manager is that it's the demand for certainty where uncertainty reigns.
Yeah.
Okay. So for our schedule, I was just reading your book on forecasting before this meeting, and so I definitely want to get up and talk with you afterwards. So, for example, every week I'd go to a meeting with the senior stakeholders, with the overlords, and they would be demanding that if something would be done by a certain date, and that date may have started the fabrication at the head of somebody at my home office when they were trying to sell the job and they built the schedule. So it's total fiction. So what I was normally doing was smoke and mirrors and trying to shield and protect my workers from any demands and changes. But what that led to was if I could speak honestly, right? It feels like it sounds similar to what you're saying with that demand for that single point of during this week executing this task, as opposed to when I've been on more flexible projects where we had a few milestones that we had to hit no matter what. No matter what, we had to hit those milestones. Everything else had some fluidity to it. So it allowed more honesty, because I could never promise the certainty they were demanding, because I was always working off of probabilities. I had a subcontractor that was supposed to show up Monday, say, and he was 50-50, thought he could finish this other job. And then I had my main guy with all the skills, my best welder, might have a kid over the weekend. I don't know. World I live in, they don't have to see that. So I'm surrounded by this chaos. So I was usually just stalling for time. Or by the time they were done screaming at me at the meeting, by the following week, whatever they were screaming about was resolved. So it didn't matter. But is that close to what you're saying? If I wanted to operationalize it, to be able to, because my wife has had to long suffer through a lot of these conversations. Like you said, it's hard, but trying to say we should operate more in a probability zone of ranges and levels of certainty. Like I'm 70% certain we're going to do that, based on these three things that I can't control that are happening in the background. Those are conversations we can't have in the industry.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're describing is exactly what led to the creation of the agile community in software development. That traditionally project management was based on waterfall, which was based on certainty about what you were wanting, what you were trying to achieve, and certainty about the technology that you were using to achieve it, and certainty about what the outcome would be when you applied that technology. So waterfall project planning works brilliantly when you're building bridges, because built bridges loads of times before, you understand the ground conditions. There are certain physical laws which constrain what you can do and you can't do, etc., etc. But it doesn't work in an environment of software development when you don't understand the technology. Customers can't articulate what it is they need, and can only tell you they need it when they see it. So you create that. I mean, that's where agile development technologies came from. And agile themselves, there was a guy called Tom Gilb who was talking about evolutionary project management 10, 20 years ago. So those things are around. There's also such a thing as probabilistic project planning, but the problem with probabilistic project planning is it gets complicated and also assumes a knowledge of probability that you don't actually have in practice. You can make judgments, but you don't have data. And one of the things I've been working on actually over the last year is using fuzzy concepts in this context. I won't even attempt to explain what I mean by that, but it's fundamentally a fuzzy set is a way of, I'm arguing that a fuzzy set is a way of incorporating uncertainty that you can only judgmentally estimate into a structured modeling process, and a project is a modeling process of a kind. So it's absolutely, your pain is absolutely relevant to this.
Well, let's catch up. Let's catch up after for sure.
Thank you, Steve. We have the last question from Daniel.
It's not really a question. It's more like I want to share something that my brain is connecting here. And I've been following a German lady who is working a lot in the field of Niklas Luhmann's
Yeah,
systems theory, which is a bit of a different kind of
yeah,
theory, but she uses George Spencer Brown's laws of form and
yeah,
some stuff from Luhmann's theory, and she describes these patterns and how together they form the shape of the communication system, and they can be used to predict the more or less the form of how the communication will go and on the like higher level, on the whole system
yeah,
level. And there is an awful lot of similarity to what you're describing, just in different terms, in my opinion.
yeah,
She
yeah,
describes like these re-entry forms, and based on which you put together, you get a different outcome, and you can reason about if you have these modules, so to say, you add that third thing or that fourth thing that will regulate the other ones, you get a different system.
yeah,
There is an awful lot of similarity,
yeah.
even
I,
though it's a
I,
completely different theory.
yeah, I'm personally convinced that there is underlying all of this stuff, whether it's complexity science, cybernetics, or whatever, there are some fundamental logical principles which can help explain complexity in all its forms, specifically to do with Spencer Brown and Luhmann. I've got Nicholas Luhmann's book on my bookshelf. It's about 900 pages long, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yeah,
frigging
difficult.
huge.
It's difficult.
And it's very difficult. And I can honestly say I haven't opened it ever.
Yeah,
I also have heard a lot from people who I respect about Spencer Brown's law of form. I tried to understand it and I just could not. It was just completely beyond me.
yeah,
My entire philosophy is how to try and help normal people do clever things without realizing it. And in order to do that, I need to understand the complicated stuff, and all of that is beyond me. And
mm,
I'm probably only going to live for another 20 years, and I haven't got time. I have to be
get
ruthless.
that.
Steve, if I could just point you to Cliff
Yeah.
Jocelyn,
Who?
Dr. Cliff Jocelyn.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Thanks.
he's a
Yeah.
cybernetician and he's also worked with fuzzy logic. So
Oh, has he?
yeah, so you contact him and he'll have
Okay,
a nice
I've been
conversation.
scouring, literally, I've been
Yeah, he's
scouring
also
the
very
globe.
fully aware of the complexity science work. And by the way, I think you should rather read some of the non-management complexity theorists, let me put it that way, politely. But I think a very useful introduction book for folk who want to kind of get to the heart of versions of complexity science is
Yeah.
the SFI Press, The Complex World, An Introduction to Foundations of Complexity Science by David Krakow.
Right, okay.
He's the English evolutionary biologist who heads up SFI now. But
Yeah.
I would actually contest some of your claims around what they do and do not understand.
Right, of course, I make sweeping generalizations.
You do rather.
Occasionally.
Yeah.
But that was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Just because I talked about the theory, like this is like one of the patterns, like one of these re-entry forms, and she's writing here like how they, relate together, and in the end, you can really put it in terms of mass and have these simulations. What kind of system will come together
Yeah.
based on those terms? And it's Gitta Payne, Ralph Payne. I don't know. I cannot really explain it better, but there seems to be a lot of similarity in what you talked about and what they talk about, coming from completely different theoretical backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I could put my finger on better, like where the similarity really is.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate that. And if those of you who've referred to other sources could just jot those down and share them with Angela, that would be great. I mean, hopefully I'll remember, but I can't guarantee it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure. You all have a good evening.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Steve. That was great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
cheers.
Thanks, Angela and John, for organising this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye. It was great.
Goodbye.